to the cloud. There we go. Welcome back, Lynne. Thank you so much for joining me for this. So I will say here, we're having some technical issues. Normally we would be live on our Facebook page and Zoom is not cooperating. So we're going to record this with all of the questions. I'm still getting lots of questions through our email address and various things. So I know that some people will have posted some questions on the link where you did your presentation, and we've had plenty come in. So I think it's going to be a fairly rich conversation, even if we don't have extra questions coming on. What I've tended to do in these sessions is ask the person to just reintroduce themselves in case they haven't seen you. So I'm Benedict Simcox from Family Voice, Surrey, and I'm welcoming Lynne. Do you want to give us a brief who you are?
Yes, sure. I'm Lynne Davis. I am a psychotherapist and I work predominantly now in private practice for local authorities supporting young people, children, young people, and adults who've had early trauma. So that's kind of my bag. But I used to work in the NHS, and so I have a background in kind of CAMS and adult services. So hence the reason I was thinking a little bit about anxiety as well, and some of those.
It really resonated. I know I won't be the only one who really enjoyed your talk, and I know I'm mum to 3 children, all of whom have additional needs, and anxiety figures very, very strongly in my 2 eldest, who are also on the autistic spectrum. So it was really, particularly with thinking about them, what I loved was your approach about explaining things and that link with the occupational therapy approach that you mentioned. It was so informative, and I felt like I had an additional whole host of tools at my disposal. I have to say, I'm loving your havening technique.
Yes.
I suffer from quite extreme anxiety most of the time, and having something, I don't have much time, but I've actually found just the rubbing of the hands, just that actually does almost immediately bring that level down. So thank you on a personal note enormously. We've got loads and loads of questions that I've got popping in from various places. So if I get a little bit scatty, I apologise. I am going to start with where am I? So here we go. My child seems to spend quite a lot of time either in the blue zone, the floppy or daydreamy, or in the orange and red zone where everything is wrong, they're really anxious, they're cross, and there's no right answer. Is it quite normal to flip-flop and not spend enough time in the green?
Yes, so absolutely. So if you think about that kind of flight, fright, freeze kind of thing that you can flip between, absolutely. So some children don't even know what green is. So some people who've had a tricky start or have had lots of additional needs, they might actually not know what green is. So that's the other thing to consider. But for a lot of young people, they spend most of their time in that heightened zone, whether that's kind of in that kind of fizzy zone, the orange and the red, and then that might tip them into blue, which is why they kind of go into that, because actually you can't sustain that for that long. Your body can't keep that high level of energy up, and so that can actually tip you down into the blue. So absolutely, it's quite common to do that, and you might have to reverse it to the point where sometimes parents will say, well, hang on, Lynne, they were really floppy and just kind of more dissociative, more kind of blue. Then we get them going into the orange and the red, and they're like, hang on, what's happened? Now I've got a fighting kind of shouty child. Oh, yep, we've got to get them there before we come down into green. So sometimes we go backwards.
That's really
that way
interesting.
too. Yeah, absolutely. You might not suddenly go just from blue to green. You might have come back via. So, you can jump around between the different feeling states as such. Yeah,
that's really interesting. Thank you. So it's another red zone. I think this idea of the zones really obviously resonated. So we have a parent says, if your body very quickly jumps into the red zone, how do you stop it or slow it down or recognize that there's nothing to fear, that it's okay to move down to amber and green?
I think it's really hard when you're in red to suddenly stop yourself, and that's one of the challenges. So actually when you go into that red zone, you lose your thinking you don't have your thinking brain on. So even if you've got lots of lovely strategies when you're in a calm place like the green zone, and to breathe, and you can walk, and you do all these strategies, when you're straight in that red, it's actually very hard to pull on them because you don't have your thinking. So there's something there about trying to keep ourselves in orange and green as much as we can. So we try not to tip into red. But sometimes when we're in red, we just need to get it out. So that's kind of, for lots of children, that's about kind of keeping it safe, getting it out, being outside so they can get big energy out, rather than trying to contain it in a classroom or, in a college environment. It's like they just need to be out at that point. And that will generally start to support the system to come back into kind of an orange.
It's really interesting, because I found with my children, we found, and I don't know how much I knew this, but certainly I did know that when they were in that really heightened zone, if I could get them to stamp around or jump on the trampoline or go outside or tear bits of cardboard, that would really help. I suppose one thing that follows me is one of my children now has chronic fatigue syndrome. And often those red periods coincide with real fatigue. And then it's that, but I don't have the physical energy to do the thing that I know will make my anxiety feel better. And I wonder if so it seems to me that the obvious alternative is the breathing, kind of concentrating on breathing. Just to be complicated, because this is something I know I've spoken to a couple of parents who had similar issues, but certainly for my daughter, it's the case. Breathing, any focus on breathing triggers enormous anxiety for her. So we've always had to avoid. I remember I did used to do things like get her to blow up a balloon.
Yeah.
But is there anything else that we can do when those activities aren't readily available?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess it's a really hard one, isn't it? Because sometimes when you're feeling unsafe, the idea about then doing what somebody else wants you to do can be quite triggering. So if somebody at that point also says, now it's time to breathe, for a lot of our young people, they're like, oh, going to hold their breath, because they don't trust our intention. So sometimes it is being quite creative with that. If kids can hum or sing or do something kind of a bit silly, blow bubbles, like you said, balloons. So something like breathing without necessarily breathing. There is something about getting young people to do some of those things without kind of saying, right, now's the time to do them, can be helpful. But I guess also that, like you said, getting the bigger energy out sometimes then allows you to start breathing. So if you can stamp big activities, because actually when you're in that red zone, small things aren't enough. There's something there about fidgeting at that point is not enough. It needs to be quite a big energy kind of thing, or in terms of a blue, you might need a full body kind of submerged in water kind of experience, so that you get a lot of that. You can use the mouth quite a lot. So in terms of breathing, something like chewing can be really quite powerful, because we use our mouth a lot. So I think you often see young people who are anxious chewing things or mouthing things. So giving them opportunity to do that, sucking on things or kind of chewing gum, those kind of things can really bring in the proprioception into the mouth, and that will allow the kind of breath to start. I think there's also something about drawing people out into the world, rather than, so when you're really anxious, you go in, so everything goes in. So trying to get somebody to look outside and see something, and how can you see the green leaves? Can you see the orange leaves? How many orange leaves can you see? And using that distraction will then start to get somebody back into that thinking part of the brain, where then you might then be able to say, okay, now it's really important we breathe. The other thing to do is obviously co-regulation. So obviously if somebody's with you and you're breathing, so your young person's not breathing, but you keep doing big breaths, you're automatically are going to watch somebody else doing that, and our bodies will listen to the other person's body. So, if we keep our breath and we keep breathing quite loudly, not, big breaths, they're going to start to take the kind of cues from us. So that
that sounds really good. Thank you. Another question that's here is, are there any alternative ways of helping anxiety, such as supplements, acupuncture, massage, that kind of thing?
Yeah, there's lots of stuff out there. Obviously, that's not my speciality, so I wouldn't be able to comment on all of those. So I am obviously into the, training in havening, but obviously that's kind of under complementary medicine at the moment. So it's come from a kind of the American kind of GP, but it's actually under complementary medicine. So that's where we're sitting at the moment with that. But anything body-based, because I think there is something there about what we recognize is that our body holds the score, as Bessel van der Kolk talks about. So actually things like that, people do get relief. So I've had people over the years tell me that they get very good relief from other kind of things like hypnotherapy or all sorts of other options. So it's not a speciality, but there are things like that. Massage is obviously, again, touch is going to generate some good stuff. That's why Havening's using touch. And if you can tolerate it, not everyone can tolerate touch, but obviously massage gives deep pressure. Deep pressure is calming for our body usually, unless we've got other associations with touch. So that can be very good for anxiety. Supplements, you know, it's not, I can't really comment if I'm honest, because it's not
no, that's fine.
Not my bag. But I would.
It's really interesting. Yeah, it's interesting you were talking about touch. Again, my daughter's likely to come up because obviously we're talking and it's really hard to dissociate your own experience, isn't it? And she used to find normal hugs and touch really, really difficult. But we discovered that if I held her sideways on, so her shoulder would be into my chest and I'd be squeezing her really, really hard. We called them cow hugs based on Temple Grandin's research into high pressure. I don't know, I came up with the word cow hugs because it wasn't about that kind of affection thing. It was she clearly had a need for that deep pressure and that helped lower her anxiety.
It's really interesting. But we had... what you're also doing there is she's facing out. So actually thinking about a fight, flight, freeze response where you're feeling trapped or feeling anxious, actually being able to see out is quite helpful. So that's why people might be also from behind, because there's something there about you not feeling like you can't see.
Yeah.
We sometimes use our vision to feel safe. So that's interesting, you're getting deep pressure, but she also had sort of an escape route in terms of visual.
Yes, and it's interesting because it had to be totally separate from what I understood as an affectionate hug, whereas you say we're face to face, which she hated. So it's interesting the kind of strategies that you find yourself desperately finding, isn't it?
Absolutely.
This is one I think that we hear about a lot from our members in the SEND community, and particularly when our children have been given an ASD diagnosis. This parent says it feels like when or if your child is given an ASD diagnosis, any mental health problem simply isn't taken seriously. We're told that having ASD automatically means you have an anxiety and there's no way to fix or alleviate it. Do you know why that is? And is there, I suppose, what can we do? Is there anything different to do with a young person to help them with their anxiety because they're autistic? And is there any way to be able to talk to professionals in the mental health service to say, actually, no, this anxiety is bigger and actually I need your help here?
It's such a hard one, isn't it? Because actually there is something about services and how they segregate everything out. And it's an ongoing kind of challenge actually for lots of parents, like you say. So I think there's something around helping parents to understand that, you know, something like ASD can be almost a sort of overriding diagnosis, like you're saying there. So people then forget that there's other things that you could have. A dual diagnosis, of course you can. You can have other stuff on top of. And we can't. We're not sophisticated enough to go in and do a brain scan and say, you know, 50% is this and 20% is, it's like, we're not that. So as parents, I know it's hard because I'll be saying to parents, hold the diagnosis, but also look at other options, because we don't, you know, you can't say your child can't benefit from other things. We know, so something like floor time is showing that people on the spectrum can do really well with kind of face-to-face and get some kind of movement in terms of how they are at their social skills. So I guess it's hard in terms of talking to professionals, but something about understanding the diagnosis can also help. So it's like I'm saying to you what anxiety is, and so that you can start to talk to professionals about, I understand that, you know, because of the diagnosis of ASD that they might present like this. However, we're also seeing blah, 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 blah. So actually you can start to help to separate out. And one of the challenges you have is that people have their specialisms, and so they often tend to get a little bit caught in that specialism. You know, my specialism is trauma, and I have to be very careful that I don't put everything into a trauma lens. That, you know, there is anxiety, there is other spectrums and disorders, so, and other needs. And that's important to kind of help with. So I think when you're talking to professionals, being able to sort of say, well, I understand this and I'm seeing this can sometimes be helpful, because so I trained under the kind of American model as such. So what you'll see in terms of under the American model is we've got different layers of when we're doing a psychiatric diagnosis. And so axis 1 would be things like anxiety and those kind of things, and axis 2 would be more of the kind of things that we consider static. So something like more spectrum or personality type disorders or things like that. And people can kind of forget that you can have different layers, both, and other things. So psychosocial comes into that as well, like what's happening in people's lives. You know, somebody might have something like a depression, but actually their whole world's fallen apart everywhere else, so why wouldn't they be? You know, so it's something about important to hold on to. It's an ongoing fight though, isn't it? And that's the truth in terms of professionals and as parents. I know it's exhausting for a lot of parents because you feel like you're constantly fighting a system, and some of that's because the system is so cut off. You know, your learning disabilities teams are separate from your mental health teams, are separate from it, and they don't talk very well. And that's
and I think that there's something about anxiety that's really difficult, because as you explained so beautifully, that actually we all have to have anxiety. It's actually it's a really positive, important thing for us to be alive, and yet we use the same word for something that is incredibly disabling for some people. And then as a parent, the other thing that I think a lot of us, particularly in the SEND community, where anxiety can be a really big disabling factor, then that notion that anxiety is catching and contagious, and we feed off each other with it, don't we? And often as a parent, we are then told that our child's anxiety is because we are anxious. And separating those and finding the language, I love the way you were explaining that actually as a parent, I can go to my doctor or to a centre and say, well, I understand this, but I'm also seeing that. And I suppose my question here would be, is there a similar way to explain that, yes, I understand that anxiety can be catching, but telling me it's my fault is a little bit,
and sometimes being a little bit like that is helpful, isn't it? So kind of being able to say to professionals, yeah, I might be anxious and my child is anxious too, you know. So there's something there about saying, you know, because I think you're right, people can quite easily kind of go, oh, well, you know, if the parents are anxious, then of course the child's picking up, and actually it could be vice versa. But equally, why wouldn't a parent be anxious if their child is struggling? You know, I think it's important that we're also saying, well, of course I'm anxious, because you know, I said to someone the other day about this kind of pandemic, well, we're all anxious, surely, you know, we need to be anxious because we're kind of concerned, and we can also separate our child's anxiety because they again are doing this, this and this. But I think when we're doing a lot of strategies for ourselves, that can also help when you're talking to professionals. So you can say things like, you know, I know I'm anxious and I'm working on my anxiety because I do this and this and this, and my child is still. So there's something there about
that's saying, lovely.
Got some strategies, I use those strategies, and my young person is still having challenges, you know, and actually we're using some of those. And I think that's where a lot of the self-help is coming through, and that's where I particularly like havening and things like that, because I think because services are so under pressure, they're quite quick to dismiss a lot of things, and so, you know, we are having to do a lot more in ourselves and the community and managing that. So actually having skills that you can use, something like havening, where we're getting good results for ourselves, but then also we can help our children with those, that, you know, we're doing a lot of that work, and then we can say to professionals as well, I've done a bit of this and it's helping, so therefore I know it's more of an anxiety, you know, again, I've tried this out, and actually when they can do the strategies, we're getting some relief, but they're really struggling to them all the time. So I know the anxiety is just sitting, or we're seeing it at this type of patterning. That's the other thing to look for, is that, you know, when is somebody anxious? What's the pattern behind it? And being able to share that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. One of the things that I think it might be worth kind of doing, almost making sure that we get from you, but just in case you have something off the top of your head, one question that we have is, do you have any suggested resources that help explain or help anxiety, particularly possibly things like YouTube?
Do you think that's to young people or to parents? Where's the question?
That's a really good question. I read it as young person, but I think it possibly could well be both.
Okay, so I mean, there's some really good books so it depends on how young we're going. So there's something about, we got some really good kind of story books for young people coming through. So things like Big Bag of Worries, where you actually start to being able to pull that apart. Obviously, that for teenagers, that's not kind of, they're looking at you like, I'm not talking about that. So we can start to look at some clips. I think the nice thing about YouTube and TED's talks, actually, that we're starting to get some more things through. So people like Dan Siegel are very good because he does short, sharp little clips. So I'm thinking about his Flipping Your Lid, and they're quite succinct little clips around that. I don't think, obviously, ACAM, people have come across it, so it's A and then CAMS. They give some nice resources, and they have kind of often put up posters and things, you know, so it's quite simple diagrams or things like that around different things. Obviously, young minds can sometimes also bring up some good kind of resource, but when I'm thinking about managing feelings, obviously in terms of the OT stuff, so we're talking a bit about the regulation, you'd be probably looking at people like Sarah Lloyd. So she's an OT that writes about trauma particularly, but actually has a good understanding then of kind of regulation. So, you know, you might be able to look for some of the occupational therapy resources around how your engine runs, for example, is another kind of program around kind of regulation, and what OT is called modulation, same thing, but different words.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you very much.
No, I think there are clips, but you know, it's a little bit kind of hit and miss, but I do like Dan Siegel's work a lot around short, sharp YouTube clips.
Yeah, that sounds really good. Thank you. Let me see. I'm looking. Oh, this rings so many bells for me. This is a parent who is asking for tips for helping a young PDA, ADHD, ASD person with learning disabilities to organize themselves, to get out of the house, particularly when they can't find their clothes, bags, lunch, whatever, and they ritualistically put it off and look for lost items at home as a way of avoiding leaving the house. And then the anxiety builds up to the point of exploding and they just stop being able to engage.
Yeah. Okay. So it's almost like a longer term plan, isn't it? Because I guess there's something there about in the moment, you probably need a bit of regulation and explosion knowing it's coming. But there is something about that preparation in advance, isn't it? And I think sometimes people being able to help young people looking at why they might be struggling, what's the avoidance about getting out of the house. So sometimes something like getting out of the house can be about leaving home, but it can also be about where they're going. So you need to be considering both about, are they worried about what's going to happen when they leave? So we need to talk young people through what's going to happen, where they're going, how it's going to be, all of the kind of sensory side of things as well. So things like what might they, you know, see, hear, smell on the way, but equally what they might be leaving behind. But then I guess in terms of organisation, it is that no kind of surprises, isn't it? So we do need to be planning in advance, helping them, you know, the week before, know what's going to come the next couple of days, planning the night before to have things ready for them so that they're not in the morning starting to get panic about where is my bag, is actually that's in the same place it's always been. And so finding kind of rituals and ways of kind of supporting them is going to be important, because in the moment actually everyone's going to struggle. So you know, they're about, you can always wake up with a regulation, so giving them something to suck on or drink or something to regulate before they start the day. So they start to come, you know, they start to wake up in a more regulated place, which then might help the process. But obviously if someone's got sensory issues and they don't want to put clothes on straight away because they're anxious about going out the door, we need to prep them for it in advance, really. About, I know you're going to struggle with this. This is going to be hard. What do we need? Can we plan for it in advance? I'll help you with this. You do that. So that we, you know, because if we just expect people to do it in a state of stress, they often can't. And then it makes the situation even harder. They can do it when they're calm, but they can't necessarily do it when they're not calm. So well, actually, you know, I might have to step in sometimes. But really starting to explore what's behind behaviour is really important too. So what are they avoiding? What is getting in the way? Because in the long term, you're going to need to help them with that, because otherwise you'll just keep.
I suppose the next one, it feels almost similar, but more fundamental in a way. I'm still, I don't know if this is the parent of a younger child, but I have older children and I'm still struggling with this, is how can we help our children cope with the word no?
Sometimes we avoid it altogether, don't we? Finding ways of saying it in a way that's not a no. So interestingly, because it's a trigger, we know that lots of no's are a trigger for a lot of people, whereas if you say it in a different way, so we can't do that now, or those kind of strategies sometimes can actually be helpful. But I guess it's also looking at, what does the no mean? So is it they know you can't go out because they feel like you're being mean? In that moment, they feel like you're being mean, and then we need to address the experience of you being mean, because why would you want to be mean? So it also might be understanding deeper than what does the no mean? No, you can't have whatever. Might mean like they feel like you're withholding and that you don't care. And if we help them with the I don't care about you, then they'll be able to manage the no. So sometimes we can prep it as well. I know you're going to find this hard, and I'm going to have to say no to that.
Yeah.
We can also kind of make it. But the other thing to bear in mind is often we'll say don't do or no to that, but we never help young people to know what to do. So they then get a bit stuck, because if we say no, you can't do that, but they don't know what they can do.
So actually possibly offering an alternative of you can do this and you can do that.
You can do that, or you can do this. Exactly. So it gives an option of, okay, so I can't do that, but I can do this. Whereas if we just say no, you can't, you can see you get a bit stuck with, well, if I can't initiate and I'm struggling a little bit with my kind of forward planning, then what do we do? And then it can generate some feelings. So sometimes being able to move past, but also playing around with that no, wondering about it. But, sometimes it's just shifting the word a little bit can actually sound kind of better to the human ear. But actually, no can be very much you're bad. You didn't say that, but that's what young people hear, particularly people who are shame-based. You may say, no, you can't do that, and they think I'm rubbish, and you didn't say that.
That's really interesting.
So shame can be one of the things to really be mindful of, is what does it mean? What are they hearing?
That's really interesting. It's kind of gone, whoa, I hadn't thought of that one, which is always a nice moment. I have a new one here. This parent says, zones of regulation is a great approach if you're verbal, but how would you advise someone with a non-verbal child to recognize from physical manifestation which zone their child was in? How, for example, could they recognize the difference between excitement or enthusiasm and increasing anxiety?
So actually, when we're thinking about zones of regulation, we're actually not interested necessarily in the exact feeling. We are looking at that kind of how fuzzy is your body, how energized is your body. So anything can tip you over into your kind of red zone. Absolutely, excitement. I always, at this point, I always smile because it makes me think of my mom, who used to say to us as little kids when we were playing, this is all going to end in tears, because we were getting so excited. And she was right, because what would happen is that kind of feeling, that energy of joy can sometimes just be too much, and we can tip over into the kind of red zone, even though it's what we classify as humans as a good feeling. And so for lots of parents, you'll see that you have a good day out and suddenly the children need to kind of wreck it because it's too much. They can't manage that. So if we think about taking the labels out, so in terms of non-verbal children and just being curious about the body, it's about kind of watching that your body is in that kind of calm place. So it doesn't really matter what feeling you're having, whether it's too sad, too happy, too whatever. It's thinking, okay, well, we still need to have regulation to come back into green. So if we're feeling too distressed, we might need support to come back up. If we're feeling too excited. And interestingly, what we know about anxiety and excitement is in terms of energy levels, they're very similar experience of energy. We just breathe slightly differently. So it's interesting about breath.
Right. Yeah.
So you often can get confused between am I anxious or am I excited? And a lot of times they come together, don't they? So, you're going off to college or starting something new, a job, you get both. And of course, we would anticipate both. And actually, it's something about being mindful and saying you probably feel both. And actually, it's okay to feel both. And what you do with both of those when your body's getting too energetic or too, you would do some regulation. So you would do some heavy work or some proprioceptive input or something that will just calm your system altogether. So, and again, children who are nonverbal, they don't necessarily have to understand that if we can help them with it. So we see their bodies getting too full up or too floppy, we might regulate them with not even using words. We do it with babies all the time. Babies go into those zones, and we automatically pick them up and rock them and soothe them and do all those things. We don't tell them necessarily, you're in the orange zone and you're feeling too anxious or too angry. We just do it. So again, we might support young people to do that, and they might have their own words. So when you're kind of working with young people, sometimes I wouldn't use the colours they might have their own. I tend to use words like fizzy because kids kind of recognise that. They're like, yeah, I am a bit like fizzy. Yeah. Okay, so when you're not so fizzy, what would you call it? And they might have a different word that they call, the green zone, the just right zone, or whatever. So sometimes the words aren't even important. It's something about just watching the body. Yeah. And we might give them words about that, and we might bring them back. If it's too excited, we also need to bring children back in. Otherwise,
it's really interesting because it's something that really struck me in your presentation, but also talking now, how we so often think of anxiety as emotion, and actually what you keep coming back to the body, and actually regardless of what we're thinking, if we can get our breathing to be right, then we're going to start to feel calmer. And there's something that certainly I find incredibly comforting about that, because that's something to do, isn't it? That you can, it's concrete. And if I can do breathing exercises or havening techniques, be it with me or with one of my children, I can step away from whatever's causing the crisis
and actually once you're out of the crisis, once you kind of are calming the body, what you'll find is you get your thinking back online. So the children can then help us understand what is happening. So, in the moment, people often say, well, why are you so anxious? And they're like, I don't know why I'm so anxious, because I'm absolutely in this fizzy zone. But actually, once they're calmer, they can say, I didn't like it when that happened. Or, and children will often, or young people will often come back 3 days later and say, when you did that, I didn't like it. So because at the moment they didn't have that thinking on, because they were too full up. So it's about regulation. And it's interesting because sometimes people can say we're being too nice. Somebody who's got angry, they might be tipping over and angry, and we do regulation. People go, well, are you, you're rewarding? It's like, no, we're not. We're just bringing them back into that place so that then they can think through why they felt so angry. Yeah. What was happening? What do they do next time? So next time you feel anxious, or what can you do? What might need help you more? What can we do differently?
It's really interesting because I spent, particularly when my children were younger, I spent so much time trying to help them to get that. And I remember a couple of conversations with one of my children where we'd managed to calm things down. And this probably was 3-4 days after a really difficult incident. And he was out of the blue able to tell me that it was something to do with my body language. I was emphasizing my point by doing this with my hand. And he was able to tell me that just, for whatever reason, sent him into the most incredible rage, and it made him angry. So presumably there was an anxiety there. But the fact that he was calm, he was able to tell me, meant that I was able to change my body language. And we got rid of 20% of all of the huge flare-ups that we were having. So it's always stayed with me, and it's, it's a gesture I've never used since.
No, actually, it's interesting, isn't it? Because there's something about, we all have that, we all go out of our zone of tolerance. We all have that. And actually, people at that point say, well, what do you, what's happening? I'm not sure. But actually, once we've had time to reflect and had time to kind of stop and think, well, actually, I started to feel like that when that happened. So maybe it was something there. And we can help young people with that too. It's like, well, okay, so I did something in that moment. I don't know what I did, but I did something, and you seem to find it really hard. When they're calm enough, like you said, they can often say, well, yeah, that thing. But we also often anticipate it to happen too soon. It takes time to process a lot of this stuff. And most people don't understand why they do behaviors. Most people haven't had years of psychotherapy to understand why they've got behaviors. And even I, who've had years of psychotherapy, still do stuff and have to think about what that might be triggering or where that's came from. And so we might need some help, but time to think, well, yeah, what was that? And we often don't have that reflective time, and young people don't, and they might need help with it. And so that's where something like Dan Hughes's model, the DDP kind of thing, that kind of people that might want to be interested in, the curiosity, what is driving behavior? how do we help young people to think about it so that we can start to help them with that kind of, why might I be doing this?
Yeah.
I mean, what might be happening for me? Because it's only when we understand more of ourselves can we then start to make changes.
And that acknowledges also that notion that sometimes we behave in a way that we don't understand or don't immediately control, which is quite. One of the questions that I have is, you talked about the fact that to some extent anxiety is a protective thing, and when we go into freeze, fight, or flight, because either we have really good reason, there's a snake trying to attack us, or our brain is reacting to something that isn't actually a threat. How do you, one of the things that a lot of parents who come to talk to us, and certainly it was the case for one of my children, where their experience of school, because they had sensory processing difficulties, was actually, it was extremely aggressive.
Yeah.
But all of the system says, oh, it's just anxiety. And I wonder, how do we and how can we marry that, where actually our children who have additional needs, who have sensory processing, actually maybe it is a real aggression and maybe their brain is responding appropriately? Does that make sense?
Well, for them it is appropriate. Actually, there's something there about absolutely, you know, if you're experiencing, it's you know, you're going to use your example there of your hand gesture. You know, if someone's waving their hand in front of your face, you know, there is something that we would automatically, you know, it's the same as if someone went to punch you. Now, you might not do that, but for somebody who's anticipating or experiencing that as being aggressive, then they're going to react maybe aggressively back, but it's appropriate in their head, because actually they've experienced you as being aggressive, and therefore we need to sometimes, like you did, change how we respond. You know, there's something there particularly around, like I said, schools and sensory systems. You know, schools are very sensory places. You know, they're very loud. There's lots of kind of sounds, smells, movements. You know, there's everything in that. And so for somebody whose body is anticipating that as a threat, of course they will get aggressive appropriately. So an example I'm thinking about is a young lady I know. She's older now, but she had a very difficult start, and so anyone that touched her, she'd experience it as kind of hitting me. They're hitting me because she was touch sensitive, and you know, so of course they unfortunately put her next to somebody. She was right-handed, they were left-handed, and so every time they would they just bashed her, and in her mind, this person kept hitting her, so she would hit back. Yeah, you know, and so like you said, appropriately, she's in her mind as being appropriately protective, and so she couldn't understand why then she was getting in trouble, because she was just looking after herself. So again, it came down to us as adults really thinking about the situation. What else could be happening for that young person, rather than getting cross with them or telling them they're not managing it well, saying, well, actually they're having a fight response. What's happening? Their body's feeling threatened. Can we change the environment? In that situation, all we had to do is swap sides. You know, we had to swap the children on two different sides of the desk, and suddenly, you know, they're okay.
Do you find that there is, I mean, I don't know if you're involved in this, but I'm intrigued, because this is something that's so, as I say, we hear about this kind of thing so much, and in our experience as parent carers, the onus is put on us and mostly our children to manage their anxiety. Well, we're saying, but their anxiety makes sense. Actually, you need to manage the stuff that's causing aggression. And I wonder, is that something that, you know, are we working with schools to help them understand that?
I think we are more. I think, unfortunately, it's generally coming through. So children in care, for example, get a lot more of that in terms of, because obviously the virtual schools can do some of that, and they're doing some training around that. And there's the big organisation Trauma Informed Schools that Margot is very involved in. So really starting to get on it, help schools understand what might be driving behaviours. I think, you know, sometimes some schools are slower off the mark to pick up on it than others, because obviously they are they're coming at it from education, and we're coming at it from a different stance. It's trying to find a balance there, isn't it, between their expectations and what they need to achieve and what we want to as mental health professionals and support. But I think, you know, it is important, because actually we are sometimes putting a lot of onus on children. It's the same, it goes back to traditional parenting in some ways. It's like about the child changing their behavior. That's a lot of pressure on a child. We need to help them. That's part of our role as parents and as kind of professionals is supporting regulation, supporting change. Otherwise, it's like, well, calm down. If you don't have the strategies to calm down, you can't, control your anxiety. What? So actually, and then of course people can feel worse because they don't know how to. So then it generates shame because now I'm just rubbish because I couldn't do it myself, or they told me to breathe, but actually in the moment I was in red and I couldn't remember to do that, and now I just feel awful. So I think it does come down to us as a kind of society really taking ownership of that and thinking, well, how do we help these young people? Particularly things like their planning, their frontal lobes. We know that it's not online properly well developed in our kind of healthy, secure, whatever you want to call them, population until 24 minimum. So for other people who've had a trickier start, or there's other stuff going on, ADHD, that takes longer. So therefore we need to put more strategies in for longer to help build that kind of their brains to help support. So I think people are more aware of it in schools, but it's a longer battle.
And I suppose you also have, with all of those expectations on teachers, that comes with that set of anxiety. So you've got clashing. It's just a mess, isn't it? I've got a couple of other things to ask you. You talk really well about the fight, flight, freeze response. I've heard more recently about a fourth that I think they often call the fawn response, about where somebody has this instinct to please the person that they feel what they're anxious with. And that, I know when I first saw that, I thought, for me, it was like a light bulb went on. I thought, that's how my daughter's been living. And it made it so difficult to get her help because everybody saw this amazingly delightful little girl who I was looking at saying, but she's petrified. I can see that she is. How do I explain that? Is that something that's just kind of that I've picked up from somewhere kooky and quacky, or is
no, absolutely. No, there's definitely absolutely. So there's something about the compliance, isn't there? There's something else. Absolutely. So people are talking more about fawning in terms of that, but also we know that there's kind of a compulsive compliance. So if you're thinking about it in terms of, well-being, if you want to join the pack, we're pack animals, so you do what you need to do to be in the pack. So that's the safety element of it. So you'll go along with lots of things, which obviously makes people very susceptible to, unfortunate exploitation and all sorts of stuff. But also, like you said there, so people can sort of believe the smile. There's a smile on the outside, but on the inside, there's so much more going on. And I think we often see that, and I see that a lot in my work, because parents will say, when they're at school or they're at college, or out and about, people would never know what they're like at home. And it's like, well, because absolutely, I said, they kind of complying, they're doing that kind of, I'm so anxious, I need to do what you need me to do. I will fit in, I will. But of course, the energy that goes into that. So Pat Crittenden she talks about her model, the dynamic maturational model. It's an attachment-based model, but one of the things she talks about very well is sort of personalities. So you get the A and you get a C. C is the behaviors are out there in the world. There's big behaviors, you see it. The A's are those compliant, self-reliant, really kind of more, like I said, sort of caregiving sometimes. They can almost look, people say they're really, young people are really empathic, for example, but actually they're caregiving, it's like,
yes.
And again, that would fit on that side. And sometimes that kind of model is helpful to show professionals in schools, because, your body will pick kind of unconsciously what's appropriate in that system. We see that.
Can I ask you that the name you gave, I didn't quite catch it.
Yeah. So Pat Crittenden.
Crittenden, lovely. That sounds, because I suspect, I say from the stories that we hear from parents, there are themes that arise, and this is one of them. I have the last one that I have in front of me is somebody who talks about, you talked about anchoring memory or event. And I think, as far as I remember, that was in dealing when you're in that red zone, if you can anchor, is that right?
When you're feeling kind of any kind of feeling, really, I think distressed in any way, what that might be. So whether it's anxious or, sometimes just pulling on an experience, a positive kind of healthy experience will almost trick your body.
So I really love the comment, and that I suppose the question is, the parent says, could an alternative be a physical anchoring, such as lying under a weighted blanket or holding a favorite toy, shaking or watching a snow globe?
Yeah, absolutely. So concrete's great, isn't it? Because there's something about you imagined is your next stage, but actually having something physical to get hold of can sometimes be very reassuring because it's concrete. So it's great. The next stage is actually being able to do it in your head. So actually, developmentally, we would have, like you said, it's interesting. I was thinking about little people who have their blankies, transitional objects. It's something like that. That's technically classified as the safety from home is their blankie, which then goes with them into the world. So absolutely, yeah. So, and weighted blankets are going to be proprioceptive or heavy pressure, not proprioceptive, heavy pressure. And the other thing that's coming through now is those compression sleeves. So you put those on your head, because obviously one of the downsides of a weighted blanket is they can be very hot. So, and heat can be quite triggering for some people. I know my son, for example, can't stand when it gets hot. He gets agitated. He gets kind of grumpy and annoyed because he's too hot. So something about kind of those kind of things that bring pressure or comfort. Touch is a very regulatory thing. So if you can, that's why animals, pets, things like that.
Pets. Wouldn't it be wonderful if they could take their pets to school? But the other thing that really strikes me in this is that obviously at Family Voice, we're a charity that represents parent carers. And so we talk to parents a lot. And as a parent, it can be there's a feeling of such helplessness in the face of one's child suffering such anxiety, and to be able to give an object or to do that concrete thing.
Absolutely. And sometimes don't underestimate things like smell. So sometimes I say to parents, well, give them something of yours that smells, because smell goes quickly. It's a very quick receptor. And I remember going to some training years ago about the use of smell to calm the system, and talking about tea bags. And actually it was brilliant because we get so many different smelly tea bags these days. They can be small and compact and have them in your pocket, but we all respond to different smells. So finding the one that is calming, but it could be a smell of mum, it could be the smell of a parent, something. People pack things like when the young person has to go away for a residential and they take your jumper with your smell on it, because actually smell is such a potent kind of sensory system.
I remember when I was expecting, I think it was my first child, I'd read something about that, and somebody was recommending if you have a little blankie or a handkerchief or something, I'm thinking for an older child, that you just wear on skin to skin and pass it over. One of the things I used to do with my daughter for a while was I'd write a word on her hand and she took that to school. But it's true that finding something, an action, as something that you can do, that you can touch, that you can smell. I think apart from anything else, as a parent, it made me feel a little bit less helpless.
Absolutely. And there's a lovely book called The Invisible String, which is about that too. So in terms of it's for young kids, but there's a lovely book about we're all connected and how to feel connected. But like you said, but something concrete is really helpful, because when you're feeling kind of wobbly, actually having something to physically touch, feel, kind of play with, again, it's already giving you a regulation rather than just trying to imagine it in your head. So great if you can imagine it in your head, but obviously just having something in your pencil bag or something in your pocket.
This has been amazing, Lynne. I'm aware that we're all of a sudden at nearly 5 to 3. Thank you so much for your time. I'm so sorry that we weren't able to have kind of live questions, but actually I think I'd have struggled to get many more in, to be honest. Thank you very much for your time. Can I ask, I've been asking the people I've been speaking with, if we have additional questions, are you happy for us to pass them to you and we'll make sure that we get the answers?
Sure,
thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem at all.
Wonderful. Once again, thank you from everybody at Family Voice.
Pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Right, I shall press stop the recording, she says. I'll try. I'm not quite there yet. I'll let you